Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about all of the quarterback battles going on around the country, even left out Georgia. So that's another one you can throw in there. I'm not super worried about Gunnar Stockton's position on that team. I think he will be the starting quarterback for them, but definitely something to watch. There's no doubt about that, and we will update you as we get throughout spring camp. Maybe someone just takes over this job that I'm not even circling right now. So we'll get into that in time, obviously, but we got to talk about something a little bit more mundane, but very, very important in the world of college football. Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC have put down their swords, at least for the time being. It sounds like they have gotten a settlement on the table for the ACC moving forward. It is going to keep Florida State and Clemson in the ACC for now, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But overall, there's a number of different things to kind of get from this. If anyone's confused about what I'm talking about, a while ago, probably about a year and a half ago, probably about this point, Florida State did sue the ACC. The argument was the ACC was not doing enough for their teams in terms of marketing them the way that they should, in terms of pushing the committee to be more give them more spots in the CFP. This obviously came after Florida State was left out for Alabama. They felt like the SEC did a better job of pitching Alabama than the ACC did of pitching Florida State. So they were very upset. They've wanted to leave the conference for a year and a half now. It's been a testy relationship. There's no doubt about that, and been very interesting. And can't imagine Jim Phillips loved handing the trophy over to Clemson this past year, but the reality is they have come to a little bit of a ceasefire, and it's a very interesting one. For Clemson, there's a number of different things to kind of take into account here. They're obviously a big-time program. There's no doubt about that, and it seems to be that they're slowly finding their way back into the reality of college football now, the new world of college football, and it'll be really interesting to see what they can do. And then for Florida State, they need life. There's no doubt about that. And it's going to have to happen in this football year. And we'll talk about Mike Norvell plenty throughout the next little bit. But this is obviously something that they very much needed. And definitely something that once they get to 2029 and 2030, it's definitely going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And we'll talk about all the different details of this, but the biggest thing is the revenue distribution. That is going to be the biggest difference that you're going to find over the next little bit in the ACC. Is they're going to divide the revenue just a little bit differently. The way it works right now, 100% of the revenue is split evenly among the 14 teams. Right now, Stanford and Cal are getting, I believe, 30% of whatever they are owed. SMU decided they were going to take no money for the first, I believe, 9 years of their contract. They're not going to take anything from that big time pool that everyone gets from, frankly, because they know they have plenty of money in the behind the scenes, but they will still not be included in that 40%. So that's still going to stay the same. Nothing's going to change about that 40%. Now, the other 60% of that revenue share will be split based on a ratings-based formula. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. It's going to be based on the last 5 years. So whoever got the most eyes is going to get the most money. And it could lead to some teams losing, I believe, about $7 million a year on the lower part of this conference, and some teams boosting up about $15 million a year in the top of the conference. So going to be really interesting to watch all of that unfold. This is a huge, huge piece of this. The kicker of this entire thing is, in addition to the total cost of, or in addition to this change, the total cost of leaving the ACC will be dropping $18 million every single year through 2029, 2030. Then it drops to $75 million. So in 2031, that's when everything goes crazy. And the short and long of all of this, and if all of that kind of went over your head or was very confusing or just too many words, a little bit of a word salad there, the long and short of this is Clemson and Florida State won. They won this battle. There's no doubt about that. They found a way to get this win, and they found a way to just badger the ACC into getting what they want. And what they wanted was a clean path out of the ACC. However long that took, however long that looked like, and the ACC is just doing the best they can. I think the reality was the ACC was never going to come out of this not settling. They were going to have to settle at some point, because you can't fight with Clemson and Florida State if you're the ACC. Same way Alabama and Georgia. You're the SEC, you don't want to be fighting with those two teams. If you're, in the Big 12, you don't want to be fighting with Utah, and all those big-time programs. So this is just the reality of the situation. ACC wanted Clemson and Florida State to stay. They understood that them ruling with an iron fist was not going to do that. They found a way to settle, and it leaves the door open. But what it always also does is give more money to these two while they're here. So the question is, do they feel okay when they come to 2030? Are they fine with the amount of money they're making comparative to the other teams? And are they a little bit closer to those SEC teams and those Big Ten teams that they very badly want to compete with? that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, because the reality is in 2031, it's going to be a whole lot easier to leave this conference, and it's going to be a whole lot easier for these two programs especially to find their way elsewhere. It's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And I think SMU is going to be a fascinating team to watch just in general, because they're not a part of that 40%. They should be part of that 60%, and they're going to be relatively high in that number. How do you factor that in? Do you go back to their AAC days and see what that looks like? Because that's an entirely different ballgame in terms of TV deals and media deals comparative to the ACC. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. They should get a little bit of a boost, but how big is that boost? How do they go about that with those new programs in that conference? Because it's a different world for SMU now compared to in the American just a year ago. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But the big question is what everyone wants to know. What happens in 2031? What happens when all of this unfolds and we're down to $75 million to leave the conference and everything else happens? Let's just be totally honest. The answer is relatively clear. They're going to find their way to these two conferences. The SEC and the Big Ten are sitting relatively pat right now. They know they have all the power. They know they have all the ability to kind of go and do as they please over the next little bit, whether that's break off and start their own thing, whether that's get a couple of TV stations to back them, which is a real reality that we can talk about next week. But a couple of different things to kind of take into account as we get into where these teams could end up if they were to leave the ACC. I feel fairly confident that they will be leaving the ACC in 2031. But at the end of the day, where would they end up? It'd be one of these two conferences. For the Big Ten, the big thing to remember is you have to be an AAU school. And if you don't know what that means, basically it means you're a big-time research institution. You're a little bit more mirrored or geared towards academics than some other universities around the country. That's just kind of the reality of that. Not necessarily an overly intense thing, but something that the Big Ten has held relatively pat. Nebraska is not one, but they were one when they joined. They lost it a couple of years later. Big Ten was none too happy about that. So that's something to keep in mind. The teams that are AAU schools in the ACC are Miami, Duke, Georgia Tech, UNC, Virginia, Pitt, and Stanford. All very, very good teams, all teams that could be looked at by the Big Ten. I think the reality is you probably start with Miami and UNC. Those are the two-time, big-time brands that you very much want. Then I think you go to Georgia Tech. You have them in Atlanta. You have a big-time media market. I think the Big Ten would be very, very wanting Georgia Tech, but I think the other side would as well. And that's the other thing to keep in mind here. While the Big Ten does have those AAU requirements, the SEC does not. So it doesn't mean that they can't take anyone from AAU school. They absolutely can. So a team like Georgia Tech, where they used to be in the SEC, why not bring them on back, get that Atlanta market? You have Nashville already. Obviously, Atlanta would be a little bit of an upgrade from that. And then FSU and Clemson just feel like SEC teams. That's the reality of that situation. Neither of them are AAU schools. I'd be a little bit surprised if they went anywhere else. Now, I've heard Florida State going to the Big Ten. If the Big Ten is very, very serious about that AAU accommodation, that's not going to happen. Now, if they release those rules just a little bit, which that is very a reality that very well could happen, then I could see the Florida State finding their way up there. I think for Clemson, it's just a slam dunk. I think they're definitely an SEC school. I think bringing that rivalry between them and South Carolina in conference is going to be huge. And then for Florida State, bringing that Florida one in conference would be great for everyone else. I don't know if Florida wants that too much. And for Georgia and Georgia Tech, I don't know how that would go down. It would be a very interesting thing to watch, but as we saw when Texas tried to join, A&M was none too happy. I don't think Florida would be very happy with Florida State. I don't know if South Carolina would be super happy with Clemson joining. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. The reality is these teams are probably going to find their way elsewhere. I think the ACC opened the door. I think they did the best they could, if I'm being totally honest. I think that deal is a way to keep these guys intact, a way to keep these guys in-house, and hopefully by 2030 keep them on the payroll, keep them in that group. But as of right now, it looks like 2031 is going to be the time. It sounds like the ACC has kind of started the clock on their own demise, and we'll see what happens over the next little bit. Maybe they can avoid it, but the reality is the ACC was always going to have to settle in this one, and I really do think they just started the clock on a lot of different things that are going to go really wrong for the ACC, but they got a little bit of time to figure some things out. I don't think anything will happen until 2030, 2031, and then you'll see some teams start to jump ship, and it'll probably start with these two. I don't know where they'll end up. Maybe Florida State and Clemson both to the SEC. Maybe they split ways. I don't know what happens. But at the end of the day, It's going to be the Big Ten and the SEC. It's going to be maybe a Super League that we can talk about next week with a lot of the different networks being involved in that. A lot of different things happening in college football right about now. As of right now, the ACC is concerned with staying alive for the time being that they can. They did that. And at the very least, they're going to live until 2031. And then I tend to believe a lot of things are going to go wrong pretty quickly, but we'll obviously keep our eye on that and see what happens once that does come. And at the very least, ACC can breathe here just for a second as we get into the craziness that is going to be the next couple of months. But overall, incredible to see that kind of off the plate of the ACC people, off the plate of Florida State and Clemson. It does kind of confirm that we're going to have another realignment storm here at some point, probably in the 2030, 2031, because that's when a lot of these media deals are up. And the reality is, right when that happens, I think the entirety of college football could change pretty quickly. And we can obviously get into that in time. The reality is, we got plenty of time to talk about that. But that'll do it for this edition of the for just another college football podcast. Getting a little bit lost here, but overall, the spring is happening all around us. It's going to be incredible to watch all of this unfold. The quarterback battles are going to be incredible to watch. Do be locked in on the blog. I'm going to continue to post my NFL draft rankings after the combine has happened. Continue to post spring content, some fun little superlatives as we head into next season. Just some different things over there on thomasbrzee.squarespace.com. If you want to check out all of that stuff, you are more than welcome to. Obviously, would love for you to like and subscribe here. Would mean the world to me. Definitely does help me out a lot, and want to keep bringing you guys this content as much as I can every single week. Wednesday will be the day going forward. This is the one that I wanted to kind of land on, officially have this week, and we'll continue down the road this week. So I will see you next week, and we'll talk about all of the craziness that I'm sure is going to unfold over this weekend, and we'll get into spring ball just a little bit more often next week. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys next time.